And what we're doing right now, I'm trying to just bring together the things that we worked on, and then I'd like to talk about Charlemagne and middle history. So then we talked about the early Christians. I would point out, everybody, in fact, there was some verses that you guys found that I thought, well, now that is really neat. I hadn't thought of that one. So obviously, I don't know everything. Some of the verses you chose were, I would say, maybe they had the word learning or teach in it, and wasn't as much related to what we were talking about, but that's part of what happens. I want to point out 2 places, and I don't know that anybody picked these. So I have to, the ones that I picked, I need to make sure that you think about. One is, and maybe somebody did this, but 1 Timothy 3:2. So men, particularly men, what do we find in 1 Timothy chapter 3? You should know this, man. What's in 1 Timothy chapter 3? Barry?
Qualifications for pastor.
Qualifications for a pastor. Okay, so qualifications for a pastor. So, and what are pastors? They're going to lead the church. They're going to shepherd the flock of God. They're going to guide them. They are examples. Okay, there's a lot of the pastor, while not, he's a man. There's only, 3 offices. There's only 3 different types of people in the church. There's deacons, pastors, and the rest of us. And there's not like a huge difference between them, but pastors are examples. And in the qualifications for a pastor in verse 2, it's a long list. And in the middle of the list, it says a bishop. Well, if any man desire the office of a bishop, so there's desire. A bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality. Class? Apt to teach. What does apt mean? Ancient English word. Able. Able to teach. So, if somebody wants to be a bishop, if somebody wants to be a pastor, they need to be, qualification to be a pastor is that they are able to teach. So, this is not a little thing. If somebody desires the office of a bishop, that's good. They desire a good thing. But if they can't teach, they can't be a pastor. Okay? That's a qualification. It's not something that you learn to do once you're a pastor. Right? Okay. We don't expect perfection in the qualifications of pastors, but they have to be evident. I was reading something today from, I don't know where it was, but having a call to preach. What's that closest to in this list? Desire. That's the closest biblical thing. The closest biblical thing to a call to preach is a desire. Okay? You might think that your call is stronger than a desire, but biblically, it's a desire. Okay? And you're the one that can say, I have a desire. But other people are the ones that are going to have to say, he's blameless, he's the husband of one wife, he's vigilant, he's given to hospitality, he's able to teach. Okay? So, the church says if a person is qualified, and one of those qualities is able to teach. So it's important that we are able to teach. That teaching is something, it's not just something that's a little part of being a Christian, of being in a church. Remember the officers that Christ gave to the church. Ephesians 4 verse 11. And he gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. Okay? What are apostles? So this is apostles. They're all gone, right? Even the ones that, those ones that say they're apostles and are not. And the bishop, prophet, apostle, prophetess. down there on Broadway in Gary. So, apostles, they saw the risen Christ, and there's no more of them. What are prophets? Prophet is someone who was recognized as being able to give a word from the Lord himself. Okay? Just imagine, for decades, people were believers, and all they had was the Old Testament. So God gave prophets. He gave apostles, but he also gave prophets that could say, this is the word of the Lord. Okay? Right? Now, there are no prophets today. There's no need for prophets today. Because we have the word of the Lord. We have the New Testament also. So those two offices, apostles and prophets, are not around. Okay? Evangelists, I think a biblical definition of evangelist is someone who's planting churches, wherever they are, they're doing the work of planting churches. Okay? So most people we call missionaries would be, by biblical definition, evangelists. Some missionaries are really pastors. They've already planted a church and they're pastoring people there. So evangelists are planting, sowing the seed, planting churches. Pastors are shepherding people. And you should know this already, but there's only 4: apostles, prophets, evangelists, and pastors and teachers. A pastor-teacher is the office. It's not a pastor or a teacher. Pastor and teacher. Pastors must be teachers. So, those 2 verses there, along with several that you guys have talked about, but those to me show the absolute necessity that churches, that Christians, especially pastors, have to be teachers. They have to be able to teach. Why would they need to be able to teach if they weren't supposed to be teaching? And why are they called a teacher if they're not a teacher? So, all right. And then, of course, the things that they would teach would be the teachings of Christ. You know, they would also they would also do a lot of interpreting the scriptures that they had in the light of the life of Christ. They knew about Christ, but they didn't have the writings that we have. As time went on, they did. Okay, but even when Romans was written, where was it written to? Rome. To saints in Rome. There was probably several churches there. And I'm sure they made copies, but for a while, where was that letter? It was in Rome. Did the people in Colossae know what was in the book of Romans? No, not until they had made copies and passed it along. So, that's where the office of prophet would be important and helpful during that time period. So they would have to, there's all of a sudden, there's a new way to look at the Old Testament, right? Jesus opened their understanding and showed them that all the things that happened in his life were in the Old Testament, and they didn't believe it at all because they were looking for something else to come. So there's a lot to be teaching, a lot to be learning. All right, so that's the apostolic church, the actual apostolic church, the church that the apostles were alive in. And then the early Christians, the time period kind of right after the apostles. These Christians, how should I say this? Okay. They recognized that paganism was awful. They mocked the poets and the philosophers. That some of them said that the philosophers, let's see here. Well, some of them said that the poets were empowered by demons themselves. Okay? Now, not everyone said that, but some of them said that. They attacked the poets who told them about all the pagan gods, but sorry, Plato did that. So it's not like only this attacking the poets for not being something was started by Christians. And yet, and hopefully this came through in the readings that I gave you, yet they demonstrated that they knew well the writings of the poets and the philosophers. Okay? While they attacked them, they rested. They had been trained to be able to think in a logical way and to be able to express themselves well by reading the poets and the philosophers. Is that hypocritical? We have to be careful. We have to be careful when we look into the Bible. We have to be careful when we look into history. Okay? I think I said this already here. But Becca Horton, she was born in the 1900s sometime. Bob Jones University started in 1927. They didn't print their first Christian textbook until 1970-something. A science book. Okay? So the idea that, and of course there was Christian writing before that, but those are the two that we're broadly most familiar with. Well, how would anybody be taught anything if they didn't read a pagan poet or a pagan philosopher? They wouldn't. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that Paul didn't write things. He did write things. They had the scriptures, okay? But those were rare. They did copy the scriptures, but it took time to copy the scriptures. Then you have the other pastors. You have Irenaeus and Tertullian and all these guys that are writing, and you could read their things, but they're doing more defensive, polemic work about Christianity, not writing a nice piece of literature that you can learn how to write from, necessarily. You understand that? Hopefully? So, we in the comfort of our 21st century, we have, if we wanted to, we probably could learn from only Christian authors. Because we have 2,000 years of Christendom authors. I mean, we can't investigate the conversion experience of everyone, but basically Christian authors. We have thousands of years of them now. Okay? But we can see from that time that it's not a big problem to be reading people who are not Christians. Okay. Now, we can't swallow everything they say, and nobody promotes that. It was interesting, I hope you caught the word invented. Martyr and Tertullian did not argue with one another. Okay, that was an invented dialogue. They lived kind of close to the same time period, so they were dealing with the same issues. I think it's interesting to note that here again, almost 1,800 years later, it's easy for us to say, I think this guy was right, and I think that guy was right. Or they both got a little right, and they both got something wrong. Okay? I dare say, I could be wrong here, because we're independent fundamental Baptists in the 20s. But let's just take all the last 1,800. If we lived in their time period, we might be good friends and quite agreeable to both of them. Have you ever tried to make a certain point and then somebody else misconstrued it completely and ascribed something way more than what you said to what you said, or at least to what you meant? Could that be happening to Justin Martyr? Could it be happening to Tertullian? They just are looking at the issue from two sides of the same glass, and probably, I dare say, probably, they did have disagreements. Tertullian even felt that maybe you should never even hold public office, because if you're holding public office in the Roman Empire, that was he thought that was condoning the Roman Empire. There was a lot of other people who said, I'm not condoning the Roman Empire, but I can hold a public office and be a Christian at the same time. I can refuse to offer incense to Caesar and still do my job as the clerk of the city or whatever. And it must have been allowable because there was a lot of those types of people. Even if there wasn't a lot, there was enough that Tertullian thought you shouldn't do it. So I'm not trying to say that they were bosom buddies, okay? But they were good men. As far as we can tell, they were believers. And they were strong Christians that looked at the issue from two different sides. And they might not be, in my thinking, I'm willing to grant that there might not be as much difference between them as what we can perceive so far away from the actual situation. But those questions and those answers were there in that time period. And I think it helps us to see that, and it helps us because it is still even helpful for us today. We, as Christians, Christians should, as long as we're grounded in the truth, we should be able to learn from anyone. Okay? If somebody is bringing to us something that's not the truth, and we have the truth, we should be able to recognize that it's not the truth, shouldn't we? Okay? I'm not saying we go around and swim in falsehood all of our life. But we shouldn't be afraid of seeing the truth, of seeing something that's not true. If we are, how strong is the truth that we have? How well have we learned it? Okay, so anyway, one point, and I might have said it in something that you read, I can't remember now, but one thing that we should recognize is that the early Christians generally felt that they were spoiling the Egyptians. Now, I don't mean spoil in the sense that I spoil Elijah and Amos. Okay? Amos and Elijah, like if they come over to our house separately, they don't ever do anything wrong. And when they're together, sometimes they fight and stuff like that, but they're not that bad. Their parents think they're bad. But that's not the spoiling I'm talking about. Have you ever heard the phrase, the spoils of war? Okay, so that's the spoiling. When you spoil somebody, you take the stuff of theirs that you want. Okay, and that's what the Israelites did to the Egyptians when they left. Remember, Moses said, "Go to your friends and say, I need this. We're on our way out." And they did, and they just took. They spoiled. They took from them. They spoiled them. Okay, they took what they could use. Where did all that material for the tabernacle come from? From the Egyptians. They didn't know it at the time, but they needed all that gold and silver that they were slaves. Did they have, I don't understand the kind of slavery they had. It was not, like they were in bars, behind bars and in chains, I don't think. But they had taskmasters, they had to report to work, and they didn't have a lot of gold and stuff. But when they left Egypt, they did. Sure enough, they did. Because they spoiled the Egyptians. They took the stuff from the Egyptians that they could use. Okay? And that's the idea that these early Christians, they used that phrase even. They could read the pagan poets and the pagan literature and the pagan philosophers, and they could take from them the things that they could use. As time went on, and there's more and more very well-educated Christian teachers and philosophers, they began a practice of every day, I don't know the phrase, but here's the idea. Every day when they would teach their children, they would say something to this extent, probably more concise, but I'm going to give the explanation of it. Today we're going to be learning from pagan poet. I don't believe the paganism of this poet, but his writings are helpful for us to be able to learn how to express ourselves well and think logically, or something like that. Okay? So every day they announced that they did not believe in paganism, they did believe in Jesus Christ. Okay. By the time of the 300s, there are Christians in every occupation of civilization. You know, 1 Corinthians says, where's the scribe, where's all of this? Well, that was written when? 55. Okay? By the 200 and 300s, there's Christians succeeding in every, obviously not temple paganism, but in every legitimate occupation of civilization. And they're excelling. Okay? They are learning. They're learning, and they know things. How do they know things? Not because there were some Christian publications out there. There was Christians who were taking the things that they could use from the pagans and using those to teach people. So, Julian's edict, basically, there is mockery and stuff in his edict, but the insult and the mockery is not the terrible thing in Julian's edict. When Julian made his edict, that meant that any secular schools were closed to Christian teachers. No Christian. Because no Christian would get up and teach from the pagans without denouncing paganism. Okay? So Christians cannot teach. How can you teach if you don't have any materials to teach with? Okay? There's no materials to teach with if you're not using pagan material. So it's closed to them. It also turned schools, basically turned schools, and somebody said this. I don't know if it was somebody that has come back for the second blessing, but somebody said this. It turned schools into centers of pagan religion rather than general culture. Remember, Rome and Greece, they were pagan culture. The whole culture was pagan. Okay? But then there were places where they worshiped the gods. Okay? And this edict said that those that teach have to worship the gods, basically. They have to say, this is the right thing, and they have to promote the gods and not just teach culture. And of course, Christians would not send their children to those places. So evidently, there were philosophers and teachers, maybe they weren't even Christians, but they were like, they didn't really much care about paganism either. They just wanted to teach. So I could send, as a Christian, I could send my child to learn from that person. He's not an evangelist for the devil. He's just teaching. Okay? But now the teachers had to swear their allegiance to the gods. I'm not going to send my children to that person. Okay? I can't. So Christians wouldn't send their children to those places. Christians resigned from being teachers. And even the pagans, even those that were not Christians, recognized that they understood that it forbade them from instructing Christian children. Of course it didn't necessarily, but if they were going to be a good person, they would respect the wishes of those Christian parents. And so they wouldn't, if they had to teach a Christian child to be a pagan, they weren't going to do that if they were a good person. See, Julian and everyone considered education in that Greek culture conducive to having argumentative and persuasive power. Not just education, but education that could be persuasive. Julian didn't want any more people out there persuading others to be Christians. So he's going to stop that. If they can't, he's going to make sure they can't learn. Christians recognize that if they couldn't learn, they would shrivel up and die. And most people that look at it agree that this may have been the most effective persecution of the Christians. You say, well, we're still here. Julian died 1 year later. Hardly even a year after the edict was given, he was dead. Now, Julian was in 340s or something like that. He's called the apostate because, of course, Constantine, we're not going to get into whether he was a real believer or not, but Constantine allowed Christianity, and Julian came after that time and was trying to crush Christianity again. So that's why he's called the apostate. So whoever came after him was a Christian, at least in the sense that he allowed Christianity to do what it wanted to with that. So, all right. I think I mentioned, I don't know for sure, that, or I put, anyway, there were catechumenal schools. Did I mention that? Did you read that? Catechumenal schools. And then catechetical schools. So catechumenal schools would prepare converts for baptism. And I read this over and over again. I can't explain it. I don't understand it all completely, but you could be in the catechumenal school for 2 to 3 years. And then catechetical schools were, and that was just to prepare you for baptism, just to ground you in the faith. And then catechetical schools would take you further with theological training. And then in AD 179, it's quite early, somebody added, beside just the Christian teaching, they added the Greco-Roman philosophy and classic literature and other academic disciplines in this catechetical school, which is associated with a church. Now, I don't know how many church buildings there were in 179, but there was a group of people that were learning those things like that. Okay? And so those schools were started to fight heresies and all that, and then by the middle of the 5th century, most had dwindled because they'd become seedbeds of heresy.